What you're watching right now is not speculation. It is not a theory. It is something that confirmed intelligence reports, US officials speaking on condition of anonymity, and real-time satellite data have all pointed to simultaneously. And the implications are so massive, so structurally significant, that most people are simply not ready to absorb what it actually means for the balance of global power and for American lives on the line in the Middle East right now. Russia has been providing Iran with intelligence about the locations and movements of American troops, ships, and aircraft, and this is not coming from fringe corners of the internet. One official described the information sharing as a pretty comprehensive effort. Think about that phrase for a second. A pretty comprehensive effort. That's the language career intelligence officers use when they are describing something systematic, structured, and intentional, not accidental, not incidental, not a one-time leak. This is an organized operation by a nuclear-armed superpower to help another country target and kill American service members in the field. Much of the intelligence Russia shared with Iran has been imagery from Moscow's sophisticated constellation of overhead satellites. Russia's satellite capability is not amateur, it is one of the most advanced in the world, and when those feeds are being handed directly to a military that is firing ballistic missiles and drones at American bases across 7 countries in the Middle East, the word that describes what Russia is doing is not support, it is not assistance, it is participation. It is a form of warfare conducted one step removed, deniable, technically non-combatant, but lethal in effect. Let me take you back to something that almost everyone missed, because the mainstream conversation has been dominated by the spectacle of the bombing campaigns, the drone footage, the oil prices spiking, and people have largely ignored the deeper architecture underneath all of this. Because what we are really seeing here is not a sudden surprise, it is the harvest of years of patient, deliberate, strategic construction by Moscow. And once you understand that architecture, everything that is happening right now starts making a completely different kind of sense. On January 17, 2025, just 3 days before Donald Trump took office, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement between Russia and Iran in Moscow. The timing alone should have set off alarm bells. It was deliberate. It was a message. It was Moscow and Tehran telling the incoming Trump administration, before he had even been sworn in, before the first executive order was signed, before any foreign policy framework had been established, that the rules of engagement in the Middle East had already been rewritten, and almost nobody was paying attention to what was actually written inside that document. The agreement is designed to govern relations between Russia and Iran for the next 20 years, covering various areas including defense, counterterrorism, energy, finance, and culture. The treaty consists of 47 articles addressing cooperation in technology, information and cybersecurity, peaceful nuclear energy collaboration, counterterrorism efforts, regional cooperation, environmental issues, and combating money laundering and organized crime. 20 years, 47 articles. This is not a handshake at a summit. This is a foundational document, a governing framework for a long-term strategic alliance between 2 countries that both share, as their primary foreign policy objective, the reduction of American power in the world. One of the treaty's key provisions commits Russia and Iran to counter shared security threats, exchange intelligence, and refrain from aiding an aggressor if either country is attacked. Do you understand what that means in plain English? It means that when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran on February 28, 2026, Russia was not simply a bystander with an opinion. Russia was a treaty partner with a written commitment. And the way Moscow has chosen to honor that commitment, without putting boots on the ground, without triggering a direct confrontation with NATO, is through intelligence, through satellite data, through feeding American military positions to Tehran so Iranian drones and missiles can find their targets more efficiently. It is elegant in a deeply disturbing way. It is warfare conducted at the maximum distance of legal deniability, and here is the part that should genuinely make your blood run cold. US officials reported that Moscow supplied Iran with real-time data on American warships and aircraft, enabling more precise retaliatory strikes. This assistance included satellite feeds from Russian assets, which helped Iran monitor US movements in the Middle East. Real-time data, not historical, not strategic background, real-time. That means as American sailors and pilots were conducting operations, Russian satellites were watching them and feeding their coordinates to Iranian targeting systems. That is what was happening in parallel to every single mission, every carrier group repositioning, every aircraft departure. and the men and women in those aircraft and on those ships had no idea that the nuclear power was tracking their every movement and handing that information to their enemy. An Iranian drone struck a makeshift facility housing US troops in Kuwait, killing 6 US service members, 6 Americans dead. And the question that deserves a real answer, not a press conference deflection, not a White House spokeswoman telling reporters it's not making any difference, is whether those 6 Americans were killed with coordinates provided by Moscow. Because if Russian satellite intelligence guided that drone to that facility, then Russia did not just enable Iran's war effort. Russia killed American service members. Not directly, not in a way that NATO treaties would require a military response, but in the only way that matters at the end of the day, which is the way where people don't come home. Now let's pull back further because there is a broader strategic logic to what Russia is doing here, and it is absolutely essential to understand it if you want to understand the world as it actually is right now. Russia's involvement in this conflict is not purely ideological. It is not simply about solidarity with Iran or opposition to American power. It is, in significant part, about money, about economics, about survival. Just before President Donald Trump's war on Iran, Russia's oil and gas revenue had collapsed by 50%, and the government was draining its reserves to help pay for its war on Ukraine, now entering its 5th year, as budget deficits widened. Think about what that means for the Kremlin's internal situation. A 50% collapse in oil revenue is an existential fiscal crisis. It's the kind of number that generates closed-door emergency meetings, that causes generals to worry about whether soldiers will be paid, that causes central bankers to lose sleep over the ruble. Russia was, by every internal metric, heading toward a serious economic contraction. And then something extraordinary happened. Within hours of the first US strikes, Iranian forces closed the Strait of Hormuz using mines, fast attack boats, and anti-ship missiles, cutting off approximately 21 million barrels per day of oil shipments, roughly 20% of global supply. Oil prices spiked from $75 to over $130 per barrel within 48 hours, triggering fears of global economic recession. 20% of global oil supply suddenly removed from the market in 48 hours. That is an energy shock of historic proportions. And when the Strait of Hormuz closes and Iranian oil disappears from global markets and Gulf state supplies become uncertain and tankers can't move through the world's most critical waterway, there is one country that does not lose a single barrel and actually becomes dramatically more valuable to desperate energy markets, and that country is Russia. On March 25th, The Telegraph, citing the Kiev School of Economics Institute, reported that the Iran war has caused Russian oil profits to reach $760 million USD a day, and profit from oil and gas sales doubled in March from $12 billion USD to nearly $24 billion USD. Read that number again, $760 million a day. In 1 month, Russia's oil and gas revenues effectively doubled. The fiscal crisis that was threatening the Kremlin's ability to fund its war in Ukraine, that crisis was solved in a matter of weeks by a conflict that Russia had no official role in starting but has been quietly feeding with satellite intelligence and strategic support. In less than 2 weeks, Russia earned an estimated €6 billion from fossil fuel exports, money that ultimately feeds the Kremlin's war machine. Now connect those dots. Russia hands Iran satellite coordinates of American military assets. Iran uses those coordinates to strike more effectively. The conflict escalates. The Strait of Hormuz closes tighter. Oil prices go higher. Russia's revenues double. American Patriot missiles and air defense munitions get consumed fighting Iranian drones over the Gulf. The same types of munitions that Ukraine desperately needs. Russia wins on multiple fronts, simultaneously, without firing a single official shot. This is not conspiracy theory. This is what strategic analysts call a second-order effect. And in this case, it is so cleanly beneficial to Moscow that you would be naive not to ask whether some of it was anticipated, because there is a very important senior Russian source, cited in news reporting, who made a telling remark. That source said, and I am quoting through the reporting here, that the escalation in and around Iran and the Gulf was already diverting attention from Ukraine, and that everything else is just emotion about a fallen ally. That sentence should freeze you in your chair, because what that source is describing is a cold, analytical Russian foreign policy establishment that looked at the Iran conflict not as a tragedy, not as an alliance obligation, but as an opportunity, a diversion, a mechanism to drain American resources, lift Russian oil prices, and reduce Western focus on Ukraine all at once. Ukraine was already facing a shortage of US-made Patriot air defense systems, the expensive 4 million apiece munitions it uses to shoot down ballistic missiles and drones. Now the US is running through those same missiles to defend against a barrage of Iranian missiles and drones targeting US bases and allies in the Middle East. the same weapons, the same supply chains, the same industrial capacity that was already strained by 3 years of conflict in Ukraine is now being simultaneously drained in the Persian Gulf. And Russia, the country whose military needs in Ukraine directly depend on how well supplied and how focused America is, Russia is the entity that has strategically contributed to both crises being hot at the same time. Tehran began supplying Shahed one-way attack UAVs to Moscow in August 2022, and Russia later began producing modified versions of the Shahed in ever greater numbers, churning out an estimated 2,700 per month by mid-2025. Think about the circularity of what you are looking at here. Iran supplied Russia with drones to devastate Ukraine. Russia helped Iran build military capacity in return, supplying missiles, air defense systems, and technology. In September of 2025, Russia provided Tehran with a series of military upgrades, including Russian MiG-29 fighter jets and S-400 air defense systems. And then, when war broke out and Iran's own ability to track American forces was degraded, Russia stepped in with satellite intelligence to fill that gap. This is a deeply integrated military relationship built over years, formalized in treaty language, and now being activated in live combat conditions against American service members. What is particularly significant and underreported is the nuclear dimension of this partnership. In April of 2025, Iranian Oil Minister Mohsen Paknejad announced that Russia would fund a new nuclear plant in Iran. The two countries would jointly undertake the construction of new nuclear energy facilities and the completion of phases 2 and 3 of the Bushehr power plant. So Russia is building Iran's nuclear energy infrastructure. Russia is supplying Iran's air defenses. Russia is providing Iran's targeting intelligence. And yet the official position from the Kremlin spokesman, when asked directly whether Moscow had provided military or intelligence assistance to Tehran, was to refrain from comment. That silence is itself a statement. It says, "We are doing this. We know you know we are doing this, and we are calculating that you will not do anything significant about it." And here is where the deepest strategic irony sits, because the one country in this entire picture that has perhaps the most legitimate grievance against both Russia and Iran, the country that has spent 3 years fighting off Russian drones built from Iranian designs while being pressured by Western governments to make concessions, is Ukraine. And yet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stepped forward and offered the United States and its allies in the Middle East Ukraine's expertise in countering Iran's Shahed drones, saying, "Ukraine knows how to defend against Shahed drone attacks because our cities have faced them almost every night." Ukraine, a country fighting for its own survival, offered to help the very nation whose political leadership had been pressuring it to give up territory. That is a remarkable moment of geopolitical clarity from Kyiv, and it exposes, by contrast, the calculated cynicism of Moscow's posture. Now let's ask the question that almost nobody in mainstream commentary is asking directly: what does all of this mean for the American people? Not for the generals, not for the think tanks, for ordinary Americans. It means this: the United States is currently in a military conflict in the Middle East in which a nuclear-armed rival power is actively feeding targeting intelligence to the other side. That is the operational reality. The alleged cooperation comes at a very delicate time for US-Russian relations, with the nuclear-armed rivals at odds over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and Washington's efforts to end that war running up against the Kremlin's refusal so far to make concessions on territory and other issues. So on one side of the table, American diplomats are trying to negotiate a peace deal in Ukraine. On the other side of that same table, Russian satellites are tracking American warships so Iran can hit them. These are not separate stories, they are one story. And the person sitting across that diplomatic table from American negotiators knows exactly where every American ship in the Persian Gulf is positioned, because Russian satellites are watching them in real time. Iran's ambassador to Russia said that the agreement stands as one of the most significant achievements in Tehran-Moscow relations, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that Iran and Russia are strategic partners and will continue to be so in pursuit of shared interests and for the good of the two nations and the world. For the good of the two nations and the world. That is the framing Tehran and Moscow use publicly to describe a 20-year treaty whose operational reality in wartime looks like satellite feeds helping to target American sailors and soldiers. The language of partnership and shared interests concealing something that, by any honest assessment, is direct material support for attacks on American forces. The White House response to all of this has been telling in its own right. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters that the Russian intelligence sharing clearly is not making any difference with respect to the military operations in Iran because we are completely decimating them. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, when pressed on the reports, told reporters that Russia was not really a factor. But here is what those statements don't address. 6 Americans were already dead. Drones had already struck facilities housing US troops, and the question of whether Russian targeting data contributed to those deaths was never answered. It was deflected with confidence about winning, which is a very different thing from accountability. The deeper truth of what you are watching right now is this: the post-Cold War world, in which the United States could operate in any theater it chose without having to worry about a rival power actively working against its military in the field, is over. That era ended gradually and then suddenly. It ended with the Russia-Iran strategic partnership. It ended with satellite constellations being repurposed for targeting American forces. It ended when an Iranian drone guided by Russian coordinates flew into a facility in Kuwait and came out the other side with 6 American names attached to it. The architecture of the New World Order is being constructed right now, in real time, with pieces that were laid quietly over years. A treaty here, a drone factory there, a satellite feed, a missile upgrade, a nuclear plant. And by the time most people look up and try to understand what happened, the construction will already be complete.